Welcome to our research presentation here. My name is Chris McCahill. I'm the Deputy Director of the State Smart Transportation Initiative, and I am joined by Madhav Chitturi, who is at the Traffic Operations and Safety Lab. We're both at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. The research we're sharing with you is integrating autonomous vehicles into transit services for shared prosperity. And it was funded by a grant from the Thompson Center. I'd also like to acknowledge the other folks we had on our team, David Noyce in the Civil Engineering Department at the university, and Eric Sundquist, also with SSTI. So the driving force behind the research here was the fact that transit will play a critical role in growing Midwestern cities like Eau Claire, Wisconsin, which was the focus of this study. Eau Claire is a city of close to 70,000 people. It's a growing city. There is a fairly large medical services sector. There's a University of Wisconsin campus and another large technical college. And so it's wrestling with how to accommodate its future growth with transit. There's also a kind of a constant buzz of emerging self-driving vehicles, driverless technologies. And, at this point in time, there are actually self-driving transit vehicles that are hitting the streets, often as parts of pilot projects. So this project is meant to sort of bring those two ideas together and answer questions shown here, like first, what transit investments are going to make the most sense for a city like Eau Claire? How can cities prepare for autonomous technologies? And what are public perceptions towards autonomous transit? So to walk through the study, I'm just going to split it into two parts here. The first part being a transit scenario analysis. So for this piece of the research, we measured access to jobs by transit using a platform called Cube Access. This is a platform provided by Bentley, and it's something that our team has actually used with state transportation agencies and metropolitan planning organizations across the country as a new way of evaluating how transit is serving the population. What these measures do is they report, for example, how many jobs could somebody reach within 30 minutes using transit from any given location. And that takes account for the routes and schedules of transit, the available walking network to get to and from transit. And the tool also reads in information about where people live and where jobs are in order to come up with these metrics. In this case here, we're actually reporting this measure a little bit differently, where we give nearby jobs a very large weight and further away jobs less weight. So a job within 5 minutes might count fully, but a job 45 minutes away only counts for a fraction. And we add those up to get the numbers you're seeing here. For our study, we modeled several scenarios with this tool. One was increased downtown transit. Another was increased gateway transit, which runs to the north, as I'll show you in just a minute. And then the third scenario involved different growth patterns. So for example, transit-oriented development, where most of the development would occur on undeveloped areas that are in central locations that are already well served by transit. So here's the results of that first analysis that I described here. On the left, you can see the downtown circulator I talked about. It's sort of a figure-8 service that runs in the downtown, which is already pretty well served by transit. You can see from the map that the impacts aren't especially large, and they are concentrated in that downtown area. And then in the center image, you can see the gateway loop scenario, where transit would run from toward this area to the northwest, which is called the gateway, and it's where the city expects more growth to occur in the coming years. And obviously the impacts up there are much larger. From the summary in the table at the right, you can see that if we look at the downtown circulator, the average impact across all households is about a 1% increase in accessibility. And then if you compare the gateway loop below that, the average impact is slightly higher at 1.6% across all households. And the reason that's not larger, even though the effect looks larger, is because there aren't lots of folks living in that area currently. We also compared how accessibility changes for low-income households. So in this case, you can see the downtown circulator is the impact is slightly higher for low-income households. And for the gateway loop, it's slightly lower for low-income households. And that just has to do with where those folks live in the city, which tends to be more central locations. The image to the right is the effects of transit-oriented development alone with no service changes. So you can see just by concentrating all of the city's expected new growth into central areas near transit, the transit accessibility improves quite a bit more than any individual service improvement. The average increase from this scenario across all households is 20.9%. So you can see that's quite a bit larger just by making land uses more accessible. We also looked at a non-TOD scenario. So this would be what we might call sprawl, or where all the new development is occurring on more outlying areas that aren't well served by transit. So there's still a significant increase in accessibility, but it's much smaller than in the TOD scenario. And then finally, we looked at some combinations of transit service and land use patterns. And you can see that there are some multiplying factors of thinking about where new development occurs and where new transit service could run. Those things do benefit each other. But generally, the land use patterns tend to be the driving force in how accessible places are for folks by transit moving forward in the future. And now I'm going to shift over to part 2 of the study, looking at autonomous technology, and hand things off to Madhav.
Hello. So in this part of the research, what we looked at was what are people's, the public's attitudes towards autonomous technology, their travel habits, and in general towards automation, their familiarity with automation, and the demographics. And before we did that, first thing what we did was we wanted to get an understanding of that potential timeline for when these autonomous technologies might be deployed in a transit setting. So the table here, which we show you here, is from a NCHRP report that we adapted for the purposes of this study. And you can see the timelines, all the way up to 2050, and then the various stages of adoption of autonomous technology within transit. And as you can see, it's pretty wide open in terms of the expected deployment of the different stages. And it's pretty gradual as well in terms of the extent of automation. And we did a survey and we got about 217 responses, completed responses. If you can go to the next slide. So we had the survey, we did outreach through the UW-Eau Claire campus as well as local media and Eau Claire transit system. So in terms of the awareness of vehicle automation, there was a high public awareness of vehicle automation. Over 90% of the respondents were familiar with, have heard of autonomous vehicles, and they actually, even greater than 90% of the respondents had owned vehicles with different driver assistance technologies already. And more than 75% of the respondents would like more of this technology in their own vehicles when they buy their vehicle next time. In terms of their attitudes towards automation in transit, so majority were unsure or skeptical about automation improving transit safety. And we also asked them a question, if they would be willing to ride a fully automated transit vehicle without a human operator. And more than 75% were hesitant or unsure about doing that. But once we put a human operator on board, even if it's a fully automated transit vehicle, an equal number were comfortable riding a vehicle. So, I think the take-home point is we have a lot of work to do in terms of winning the public's trust in automation. So the work is cut out for us in terms of both policymakers as well as the technology developers, that we need to plan the deployment of these automation technologies in a manner where the public's trust also rises along with the deployment. And in terms of the respondents, nearly half of the respondents were from UW-Eau Claire, and we had respondents from all age groups. So those are the major findings from the survey.
Thanks, Madhav. With that, I'm going to just sort of jump into some of the policy implications that we saw as the major takeaways from this study. These apply mainly to Eau Claire because we were working so closely with them and had opportunities to talk through some of these implications, but they're certainly applicable more broadly. The first set of implications has to do with the land use policies and transit planning. So sort of the first part that I talked about earlier. One of the important takeaways was the importance of leveraging existing transit routes. So as you saw, being able to rely on the existing transit and encouraging the growth along those lines is going to be really important, perhaps even more important than thinking about adding new lines. And this had an important overlay with the autonomous, the deployment of autonomous technology as we sort of looked at both of these in a single lens. The near-term deployment of some of these technologies in transit vehicles is most likely going to be in low-speed environments where there's dedicated infrastructure and technologies built into the streets to support these vehicles, which makes those downtown areas more ripe for piloting and deploying some of those technologies. So that's sort of an advantage of thinking about land use and transit together. The second policy implication here is the need for zoning changes to encourage some of that development. So it's one thing to talk about where development ought to occur, where it could occur, and it's another thing to put policies in place to make that happen. We actually did a little bit of follow-up work with the city to think about some of these changes. And what this means is, in those transit-oriented areas where it makes sense to have more growth, you might need to make changes like allowing more multifamily housing instead of just single-family housing, and sort of also reducing the parking requirements to make it easier for that more compact development to happen in those areas, which we're calling infill development areas. The second area of policy implications has to do with the incremental adoption of autonomous technologies. As Madhav mentioned, we aren't likely to see the sudden deployment of self-driving vehicles. It's going to be a matter of pilots and incremental technologies being added onto vehicles. In doing that, there is going to be need for some safety assurance that the transit agency can be thinking about now. A lot of this is going to be driven by federal and state policy, but it'll be important for small transit agencies to start adopting some of these technologies, to test them, make sure they're safe, make sure that their staff knows how to use them, and even actually think about safety in new terms. So not just the safety of operating and riding vehicles, but the safety of the computers that are on these vehicles, and are they vulnerable to hacking or other sorts of issues. So basically gradually start thinking about some of these technologies. And the second area is in workforce development. So again, it seems not likely to see drivers being replaced by self-driving vehicles anytime soon, partly because of the gradual deployment of the technologies, but also, as our survey showed, folks aren't necessarily going to be comfortable without having a driver in the near term. And transit staff are still going to be needed to do other things other than driving. That is, assisting customers and riders, and being able to take over the vehicles in the case of an emergency or some sort of malfunction in the self-driving technology. But again, over time, I think the needs of the workforce are likely to change. So it will be important to understand what the new skills required of transit drivers might be, so that they can learn those new technologies and new tasks that might be required. So that's pretty much it for this brief little overview of our work. And of course, you can find more information about either of the work of either of our programs at our websites, which are listed here. So thanks for joining us.